Hello everyone, my name is Rebecca Kelly and you're listening to the Everywhere We Go podcast. On this week's episode, I sit down with Peggy, who is a wife, a sister, a mother and a grandmother. Peggy talks about growing up in the 60s and 70s, childhood responsibility, being Irish in London and the loss of a sibling through suicide. Scary convents and getting the legs walloped off you. There was nothing like growing up in the 60s and 70s, unless there was. Everywhere we go, people want to know who we are and where do we come from. So who are you and where do you come from?
My name is Peggy. My official name is Margaret. I come from Artane.
I'm already calling you Peg.
Yeah, you're okay. That's the name everybody knows me by, except for my posh friends.
Posh friends.
By Margaret.
I just want to start from the start. So when were you born and where?
Well, okay. I was born in 1900 and blah blah. Now, I don't ever give the year I was born because I was told once by somebody, don't ever tell anybody your age when you go over a certain age. I know I was born in Pearse Street. Now, I know I was born in Holles Street Hospital. My earliest memories are of living in Crumlin on Windmill Road. And I remember, it's so strange when I think back on it now. I always thought we just all lived in one room. But as a child, I can't remember beds for some reason. We probably had bedrooms, but I do remember just one big room and a little cupboard where we got coal, the fire, and the coal was always getting shoveled inside there. Things like that now I remember, but I can't go really that far back because I've just got to a stage in my life where sometimes I can't even remember yesterday. But there's certain moments in my life, yeah, I can remember.
Talking about that, so you were originally a Southsider, so what took you over to the North Side?
We moved from Crumlin to Churchtown. I suppose in the days when we were just a little bit posh. No, that's a joke, really. I don't know what the reasons were behind it. I think because as our family increased, we just went to a bigger house. And in Churchtown, we did have a bigger house. It was 3 bedrooms, and it was lovely. It was quiet. It was Southside. My mum always wanted to be Southside, but my dad was from East Wall, and she ended up marrying a Northsider. She always said she should have stayed on the South Side. That's how we ended up there. And I went to school in Rathfarnham. I went to Loretto College, and for some reason when I was around, I think 12 or 13, my dad, I don't know what had happened, but we were shifted off to the North Side, and I stayed in Rathfarnham School, and a teacher from Clontarf would pick me up at Clester Church. So I continued my schooling right up to I finished off all my exams, and so I was quite intelligent in those days. I actually won a competition for the whole of Ireland at the time. I'm not very religious now, but I do believe in God, but we had to write an essay for how we'd feel if Jesus was to come again, and I wrote an essay which went all over Ireland, and I ended up getting a lovely missile from the Bishop of Ireland at the time, who signed it, and my name was written in Irish. It was all in gold, and I wish I had it now because I really don't know what happened. And I remember the nun coming down to the house and saying to my mum, she's going to be a great writer one day, encourage her. And my mum said to me, don't get any fancy notions about yourself. You're just going to end up like me with a gang of kids and married. So I never got any fancy notions about myself, and hence I ended up with 5 kids, married, and I never became a famous writer. Well, I've done a little bit, but I've never became what I should have become if I had have stuck to what I was aspiring to at the time.
So just take it back slightly to that story you wrote. Do you remember what you wrote?
I remember I had a really vivid imagination because as a child I always saw angels, and this is something that people don't believe in, but I always saw angels. So I always had a firm belief in angels and in the spiritual. I believed the Bible. I was fascinated by the Bible as a child for some reason, because we had a big family Bible which had loads of pictures in it, which for a child, pictures are the one thing that draw you in. And the pictures in it to me were just brilliant, because they were showing like the temple, Samson and Delilah, all those type of things, the temple coming down, Samson with his long hair and Moses and that. So that's how I kind of became really fascinated about Jesus at the time. I was quite a holy child, but at the time we didn't really have much choice, because we kind of had to get confession every Saturday and we had to go to Mass every Sunday, even though we didn't have any sins. But the story I wrote was probably, I actually thought that Jesus was a really good man. I elaborated on how I would feel if I was to sit beside him, and the feeling I would get, and that he would be surrounded by angels when he came, which I knew when he had come that it wasn't really like that. So I always felt protected as a child.
And come here, for your teacher to put that trust in, trust is the wrong word, but actually to put that, maybe her faith in you, that she thought you were going to do very well, that she was picking you up from Colester and bringing you over to Loretta's as well. That's unbelievable.
She was just a teacher who happened to work in the school. And I do remember at the time, now, we were probably, because we came from Rathfarnham, I always thought I was a little bit better than everybody else. It took me years to realise I wasn't. But I remember at the time, because we had moved to the north side, and Clontarf was quite posh then, which it still is today. I always remember, because I had moved to Artane, this teacher, her two daughters travelled in the car, and they would kind of look their nose down at me, and I didn't feel they were any better than me, because I felt I was better than where I had moved to, which at the end of the day I wasn't, because moving from the south side to the north side, I know it's going to seem strange, but I actually never heard the word F till I moved to the north side. I never heard it. The only words we ever heard from was feck. That's all my dad ever would say, was fecking this or that, but we never heard the F word. And all of a sudden it was like someone was after throwing me into the Wild West. Because I obviously must have been very full of myself, and I think I used to walk by some of the girls who lived on the road and listen to the language and say, oh my God, beam me up, but no, it did take me years. I say F quite a lot now.
Just going back to God piece, have you taken that through your life, or have you lost that faith a little bit?
No, I've never lost my faith. I can't say that I'm a good churchgoer. I feel like I allowed my own family, my own children, to make up their own minds when they got to teenage years what they did. The church kind of terrified me as a child, because when we lived in Rathfarnham, we had one particular priest, and he was a famous artist at the time. I won't say his name, but he's more than likely well gone by now. But if you walked into the church as a child and you saw he was the only priest in the confession box, you were terrified, because you knew you were going to spend about an hour on your knees, and literally we had no sins on our soul. You had to go in and make up your sins. Like, I gave my mum and dad cheek, or I told a lie, and I don't remember really telling lies, because the one thing I have a phobia about is lies. I hate lies. I absolutely hate them. And he seemed to be always the one priest that was there, and he'd give you about 20 Hail Marys and 20 Our Fathers for nothing. Every child in the parish was terrified of him. But I do have a really strong belief in our Lord. Well, I go to bed every night and I say a prayer to the Sacred Heart to protect my kids, to protect me, protect the family. But I do. I've kept that faith all through the years, and I do believe that I do have a guardian angel.
So Peg, if we were to go back, you said there at the start that you moved to a bigger house because the family grew. So how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I had 5 brothers and 4 sisters. We were a family of 10. I was the oldest girl. So there was, I think, about a year and 5 months between every one of us. So my mum really had a pretty tough life.
So Peggy, I am an only girl. So what was it like for you growing up with all those girls in the house?
Oh, I have to say now, I don't really, going back on my childhood right now, I had the sister who was next to me was sick as a child, so she kind of spent a year in hospital. She had TB, and I kind of felt like because my mum was only allowed to go up and see her once a month and nobody was allowed to go and see her, they were just terrible days. It was kind of tough because being the oldest girl, you were kind of given more responsibilities, and because the sister who came after me was sick, she would have had kind of an easier life, and then my other sister had a fairly easy life too, because she would be in and out of hospital with, I think she suffered with her kidneys. And then my 2 younger sisters were, I was kind of like the mammy of the family, so I learned how to cook fairly young, and I learned how to clean very young, you know, how to get down on my knees and polish floors and wash floors. And the one thing I don't do today, and I always swore as a child I will never do it, is iron a shirt for a man. That is one thing I totally refuse to do, because I had to iron shirts for my 5 brothers at the time. That was my job, was ironing, and I hated blinking shirts. I actually hated doing the collars and then buttoning them up, and I swore when I grow up and get married, if I get married, I will never iron a shirt again. And believe you me, I never have.
When did you realise that your childhood was kind of over?
This is strange saying, I don't even remember having a childhood, if you could. Yeah, I think because I was always being held responsible. My dad, God rest his soul, is gone now, but my dad with me was very tough, and I kind of remember I didn't have a great childhood with my dad, as in he was tougher with me than with the other girls. I don't know whether it was because I was the oldest daughter. Me and my older brother would spend a lot of time down in his dad's house, who was my granddad, who lived in East Wall, and ended up that my older brother spent probably the first 8 years of his life nearly staying there, because they just wanted to kind of hold on to him. I came home. There is strange things I remember about being in East Wall. The one thing I liked about being there was we always got fried egg and fried bread. That's the one thing I liked. That was with my aunt lived there, my uncle lived there, and my granddad and my granny, who I absolutely loved. She was my granny on my dad's side, and even though I don't remember a whole lot about my childhood, I always remember my granny Moore, because I always remember her being a real lady. She always had her hair in a bun, and she was tall. She was always real gentle, and I knew she loved me. You know, I knew my mum loved me, but because my mum had so many kids, you know, we couldn't. You can't feel your love when you have a load of kids. And it was really tough for the women in those days, and I only realised it today. But as a child, you don't realise it, so you kind of feel that you're left out if you don't get all the love that you think you should get, or that I would have given to my kid in this generation now. That was the one thing I always made my kids feel, that they were always loved.
Did that make you, in your teenage years, rebel against your parents?
No, I never rebelled against my mother. I took up from my mother quite a lot. My dad was the old Irish man, who was fond of his few pints. So me and him would fight quite a lot. Probably because I was the oldest girl and I would take up from my mum. No, there was never any violence in my house. But you know, when there would be arguments as regards, like probably a few drinks on them. But I was always the one who would come up against my dad. You know, my mum wouldn't come up against him the way I would. I was the one who did all the wallpapering in the house, and I was always very handy. And my dad would come in with a few drinks on him and start picking at it and saying, "Oh, this wasn't matched to that. This flower is not matching." And I would turn savage on my dad. I was terrible wildcat. Yeah. When when I turned about 16, 17, I became I stood up for myself. I'd never really stood up for myself as a child. So when I turned 16, 17, I kind of really stood up for myself. And at that stage then, we were living on the north side. And my first job when I left school was I went straight to work for Eason's as a bookkeeper, and which today I would have been a fully qualified accountant. So I was working for Eason's for about 9 months, and then I realised that my sister, who was probably only about 15, was earning more money than me at sewing. So I decided to leave my good bookkeeping job to go sewing, and I couldn't sew, but I actually did stay sewing for years. I stayed sewing right up to the time I went to live in London. I went to live in London when I was 22, and I was actually working for a company, Lee Marks, in Ballyfermot, and went out with the boss's son. Would you believe? No, and that was good. And then I left there. So I could have been an accountant today if I had stuck. I never really had any ambitions, and I'm sorry I didn't, because I had so much going on in my head that I should have used it. Like all the girls I worked with used to get me to write their Valentine cards and get to write all their poems and that on them. And one particular friend of mine who now lives in London, she married an English fella, and he used to write her letters, and I used to answer all his letters. And as he said to me years later, it was you I fell in love with. It was all the letters that made me fall in love with her. We have a laugh about it now. She said to him, I never wrote you a letter. She used to write all the letters. I used to write lovely romantic letters back to him, because she'd say to me, here, answer that letter, So things like that, like I did throw talent I had away. I had a little bit of success though at writing at one stage in my life.
And tell me this, talking about your wild days as a teenager, so you and your sisters, 12
of us would go out in a crowd. Well, my sister, who was younger than me, got married quite young. She got married, I think she was 18 or 19. I was very, very fickle, so I went through fellas like I don't know what. Had a few marriage proposals, and the things with my dad was he used to say to me, oh geez, if you were good looking you'd be dangerous. My friend used to think I was vain because I wouldn't go out without eyeshadow and mascara on me and a bit of lipstick, and she used to think it was vanity, and it wasn't. It was because I didn't like the face that I had, because my dad would say things like to me, oh, your sister's going to take all your fellas off you, and you're not going to have any luck. So as a result, I went through fellas just to prove to my dad I can do it. And so I did turn a little bit wild at around 18, 19, and the nightclub at the time was Sloopy's, and I would say 50% of the time I would end up asleep in the girls' cloakroom with my head down on the bench. But my sisters used to say, oh, just leave her, she's grand. And I was always grand. Gangs of us used to go out, and we were coming then into the real hippie days. Well, we were kind of in the hippie days. Now, believe you me, in the hippie days, never touched a drug in my life, never had a joint. There was a lot of people smoking joints then. My only vice was drinking. I never touched a cigarette either. But the Green Dolphin was great because there was a great crowd in it. It was where my brother ended up with his wife. My other brother ended up with her sister. We were all always drinking together, and I wore all the maxi clothes, where my sisters wore the hot pants and the minis. And my dad used to say to me, you look like a gypsy. I didn't care. I actually fell down the stairs one night. I was so drunk, and went to Sloopy's and danced for the whole night. And the following day I couldn't even put my foot to the floor. Ended up in Jervis Street Hospital with all the ligaments of my foot torn, and the doctor said to me, you danced all night on this foot. I said yes. The days when I could drink and I can't drink anymore, it's terrible. I'd love to get drunk. Oh no, I'd actually love it now. I would just love to go back to the days when I did silly things like take off my shoes and stand up on tables and sing songs and things like that. I did go to London when I think I was 22 when I went, and Marion came over to stay with me for a while. And I remember at the time, I think I was 21, and I remember I just wanted kind of wanted to break away. You know, I kind of felt I'd been like a mammy most of my life. I felt like I'd always cooked, cleaned, being a mammy. And then a girl I worked with in Lee Marks, we were chatting away one day, and she said to me, "Oh, I'd love to go to London." And I said to her, she said, "Would you come with me?" And I just said, "Yeah, why not?" Like, they were days when you could do things like that. And I remember going home and saying to my mum and dad, "I'm going to London." And my dad said to me, "Go to London and don't come back," you know, because you just didn't leave your home then.
How did you get there?
No reason. We actually went there by boat to London. I think I left about 4 weeks after I said it. And I went to stay with a friend of mine who was married by then. My friend from East Wall was married, and she put us up for a week. And then we got an apartment in a house where we had the middle floor in the house. There was like a bedroom, a sitting room, the days when you could get apartments. And we had to share a kitchen and a bathroom with the other tenants. There was a French couple overhead, and there was a Greek couple underneath us. And it was right in the heart of London. It was the Essex Road. It was actually Ockenden Road, which was off the Essex Road. And when we arrived there, I remember being in a taxi. And the thing in my day was, with Irish fellas, you could chase them for so long that by the time they realised they fancied you, you were gone off them. And then arriving in London was a whole new ball game, because we were asking this taxi driver where to go to, and he said, "Oh, go to this pub called the Blind Beggar," which was in Whitechapel, which, if anybody is familiar with, the Blind Beggar, it was where the Cray twins were in the old days. Now, they weren't in my day, but they were in the old days before that, and it was a real East End pub. So we were like two lambs to the slaughter. We were really innocent. I had me long blonde hair and me maxis, and I was like a little rake. I was about 7 stone, and my friend used to wear her minis and her long boots, and she was lovely looking. She was dark. So we stopped at this pub and we walked in, and as we walked in the door, there was music playing. There was a DJ, and the music was blaring in the pub. And by the time we reached the counter, I had 5 fellas standing around me wanting to buy me a drink, and I said, this is a joke. And they were all saying, "Buy a drink, love," you know. And I was going, no, thanks. I said, "Oh my God, this is different Ireland." And they thought I was Swedish, and they thought Jean was American, and they thought all Irish girls had red hair and green eyes. They couldn't believe that you could get an Irish girl who was blonde with blue eyes. That was a massive shock to the English then. And that was how my life started there. And while I was there, and I think the owner of the pub saw I was quite popular, not being a big head, offered me a job. He said, "Would you like a job as a barmaid?" And I said, "Well, I've never actually done that." And he said, "Oh, you go down a tree here." So within the following week, I started working in the pub, and then we got a job working for a company that was kind of related to Twinlock. It was a plastics company, and my husband, the guy I'm married to now, my husband Barry, actually worked in that place. And when we walked in, I looked at him, and I thought he was the image of every picture I'd ever seen of Jesus Christ. I know this is a terrible thing. He had long hair, he had the long tash, and I looked at him and I said, "Oh my God, he's the image of every picture we have of our Lord at home." And he gave me a wink, and his friend gave my friend a wink, and I thought, "Oh, he's lovely, he is. You know, he's really nice." So, and he was really, and I have to say, he was really nice then. He's still nice.
What was it like being Irish?
Well, at that time, all the troubles were going on in the north, and being Irish, working in an East End pub. But when I started working in the pub, I was very popular. A lot of people liked the Irish, and I have to say the one thing about the East End people: if they like you, they love you, and if they don't like you, they don't like you. So because of the troubles between the Irish and the English at the time, if I was speaking to somebody, some of them would say, "Are you effing Irish? You know, what are you doing working in an East End pub?" But because the patrons who went into the pub liked me so much, I was very well protected. You know, nothing would ever happen to me. I actually started going out with the DJ out of the pub, and I was a floozy. No, I was going out with the DJ for a while, and the owner of the pub was very fond of me, so I was quite safe. Because the East Enders mothers they really do look after you if they like you. Yeah, if they like you. But I did put up with a lot of stick as soon as I would start talking. And then Marion came over to me as well. She stayed with me for a little while, and he had, my friend was going with an English fella at the time, a fella she'd met over there, and she was very, very possessive of him. And I remember Marion coming over, staying with me, and I asked my friend's fella, Jimmy, who was very fond of me, but not as in a romantic way. Him and Jean were together, and they were constantly breaking up, and he'd say, he called me Maggie, and he'd say, Maggie, the only reason I'm getting back in with her is because of you, because I know you have to put up with her. And I remember Marion coming over and me saying to Jimmy, will you just look after my sister and make sure she's safe, because I was working behind the bar and it was very hard for me to keep an eye on her. So Jimmy, of course, went all out to make Marion make sure she was safe. And then next thing, my friend says to me, give me my jacket from behind the counter, I'm going home. You know, she was showing a little bit of the green imp sitting on her shoulder, and I said to her, stop, Jimmy's only looking after Marion for me. And I have to say, Marion played the part very well. I mean, when Marion knew she was causing trouble, she went in like a soldier. You know, I'll take you on, you know, you're okay. So Marion would play along with it, and my friend stomped out of the pub. Now I was living with her and Marion was staying with us, so she stomped out of the pub, and next thing all I could hear was this big commotion outside, and a couple of the guys ran back in and said, oh, Maggie, you'd want to come out, your sister's lying on the ground, her nose is bust. And I said, oh jeez, what's after happening? So I went out, and Marion of course had a few drinks on her, so she wasn't feeling it then. And she was lying on the ground and her nose was all split open, and my friend was saying, I'm sorry. She was in a state, because apparently Marion had gone out to say, oh, just it's okay, just hang on, don't go, you're being silly. And she just pushed her, but when she pushed her up against the wall, and Marion's face went into the wall. And we were across the road from the London hospital, and I had to take the night off work, bring Marion over. They had to strap her into a bed to stop her from killing my friend. And my friend came into the hospital saying, I want to see my friend, I'm so sorry. And she was crying, because she'd kind of sobered up a little bit, and Marion of course was going to kill her, and she ended up looking like Catwoman, because the following day her nose was all over her face, and she had two black eyes. And
oh my God, she'd never tell me that. And tell me about Barry.
Well, he asked my friend out first, as they do, and then decided after about 3 weeks it was actually me he fancied. My brother, who had gone to England when he was kind of 17, had gone, I could say he'd gone missing the year before I went away. And my mother was writing to every organisation in England saying, could they find him, because we'd got one letter back saying, not known at this address. When my sister had her first child, my mother let him know. And how I ended up with my husband, this is very relevant to my brother. He was troubled, as in he had a very split personality, which in those days you wouldn't have known. We kind of knew, like 1 minute he'd say to you, oh, you look lovely today, and then 5 minutes later he'd say, what are you looking at, you ugly bitch? So it was things like that we put up with. So he was very troubled. Anyway, when he went to England, before I went to England, I had been going with an English guy who was a pen friend of mine, and the last time I saw my brother, I was going over to meet this fella's parents, and my brother said to me, my last memories of my brother was as I was leaving the house, I said to him, what are English people like? Because I'd never been to England. And he said to me, just go to England and be yourself. He said, you're my sister, you're beautiful, and he said, they're going to all love you. And he grabbed a hold of me, and we never showed affection in those days. Not like today, we're all real huggy with each other. Years ago, we didn't have all that kind of affection. And I remember he grabbed a hold of my face and he kissed me on the lips, and I pushed him away, and I said, get away out of that. Then I went over to this fella's place. I wasn't in love. He asked me to marry him. I was very, very fickle. And then when I came home from England, my mum mum said to me, George was my brother, he's gone again. And I said, what happened? And she said, we had a fight over you. You'd never been able to make up your mind, and about how nice this guy was and how things were going to work out with him. And we had an argument, and he packed his bags and he went. And then he wrote to me then that year, and he said, well, are you going to get married to Sid? And he said, because I'm tired sleeping on park benches, haha. And I wrote back and I said, no. I said, I'm not going to get married because I really, really like him, but I don't love him. And he wrote back to me and he said, Peg, one day someone's going to hurt you really bad. And he said, I hope it never happens to you. He said, because he was one nice, really nice thing. And that was the last time I heard from him. I got a birthday card from him, and he said, tell my mum that sometimes what comes out of my mouth is not what's in my heart. And I kept that card for ages until I had the attic converted in my house. I don't know what happened to it. It's probably still in my house somewhere. And then when I went to London, my mum used to say to me, watch out and see, do you bump into him in the street? But every second fella I met looked like him. And it was stupid because I always thought he was good looking. He always had this kind of lost about him. And like when I'd be walking through London, there's so many lost people in London that everybody I'd bump into, I'd say, is that him? You know, thinking that I'm going to find him now for my mum, and I'm going to make everything okay for her. I'm going to make everything right. And then how I ended up with Barry was, I had actually gone to see the movie A Clockwork Orange. I don't know if anybody will remember that movie. It was, in those days it was kind of a really over 18 movie to see. And I had gone out with the disc jockey out of the pub to see it. And my dad had followed me over a few weeks previous with a friend of his, and he'd stayed in a hotel. And I said, what are you doing over here? And he said, I thought I'd come over and check up on you. He said, it was only when you were gone I realised just how much I was going to miss you. Like, he never actually said he loved me, but I kind of knew then. And then he went back. The day I found out about my brother did committed suicide in England, which we didn't know about. And my mum was writing to the Samaritans, and she was writing to a radio show over there, and the radio show would put out, George, if you're there, will you contact your mum back in Dublin? And then that day I went to see A Clockwork Orange. My dad had gone back to Dublin, and as I was walking down the Ockenden Road, my vivid memory was I said goodbye to also another Barry who was working in the pub. Said goodbye to him, got off the tube at Whitechapel in London, walked from there, and as I walked up towards the apartment I was in, I saw my dad standing at the front of it, and I said, what's my dad doing back here? And he says to me, you get in there, he said, you're up to the same shenanigans over here that you were in Dublin. He said, you have a fella sitting in there waiting for you. And when I walked in, there was Barry, who I'm now married to, sitting there in the chair, and I gave him a dirty look. And in the other chair, because it was a huge big room, my mum was sitting there, and I threw my arms around her. I said, Mum. And Barry was still sitting there, and she said, this fella called down to see you. And she said, we found out about George. And she started to cry, and I said, is he in prison? Did you find? Because that was my first thought. Oh, he's locked up or something. And my mum said, no. She said, he's dead. And with that, Barry, who I'm married to now, jumped up and he said, can I make everybody a cup of tea? So he went out, and he didn't know what to say because he was constantly turning up, and I wasn't going out with him. And he got that embarrassed. He just kind of said, oh, I'll make everybody tea or coffee or whatever. And my mum was in floods, and I was in floods, and I said, when did you find out? And she said to me, he's been dead a year. And she said, but I have no idea where to go to find out anything. And I said, Mum, I'm not even here long enough to know. I didn't know how you went about where he died, how you went to a hospital, to a coroner's office or wherever. And Barry said, oh, don't worry, I'll take 2 weeks off work. I'll bring you everywhere. And that's how he became his rock. Like he just took all that time off, and he brought her everywhere. He brought her to the hospital that George was taken to, brought her to the last place that he lived. We went to the coroner's office. She couldn't get any records off the hospital because they said they were all private. Now, I mean, that was something something I couldn't understand, because when you lose your child, you're entitled to know, what your child was attending the hospital for. But I would say that he had been attending the hospital with his mind, maybe.
Really?
I think that was the first major shock in our lives. Well, in my life, that was a major shock, because me and him would probably have been closer than, because we were like only a year and I think 4 months between us, and I spent like the first maybe 5 or 6 years of my life down in East Wall with him. We would have been closer, so it was a shock to find out. That was the first big trauma in our lives.
And did you find out what happened to him?
Yeah, found out that about a month before he had died, he'd kind of taken a little bit of a breakdown. The landlady we found out where he lived, and my mum went and had a talk with her, and she was saying that about a month before he died, he'd taken, he'd thrown all his stuff out through the bedroom window. He'd cut up all his clothes. He had her whole garden was scattered with photographs that were all in tiny little pieces, probably all our photographs, letters, whatever. She knew absolutely nothing about him that she could have traced anybody, and she got a local priest to come in and see him, and he went in, he talked to him, and he said, no, he seems fine. He said, I think he just went through a little bit of a crisis, but he had shaved off all his hair, which was strange, because he had blondish hair, and he had good hair at the time, but he shaved it all off. And then the night before, like Friday the 13th, which I'm still superstitious about, was the day he died. On that had happened to him a few weeks previous, and on the day before he died, he actually wrote her a letter, and he put it under her door, and he had written to her, Dear Diane, her name was, I'm slowly losing my mind. I have nobody in the world to turn to. I have nobody to talk to, and I have nobody to help me. Please help me. So she didn't get the letter till she arrived home from work, and her boyfriend was a policeman. She asked him would he go up and talk to him, and he went up, and he kept knocking on the door, and he said he knew he was in because he could hear music on, but he wouldn't answer the door to him. So he said we're best just leaving him alone and maybe talk to him tomorrow. And she said the following day he came down the stairs, and he says good morning, as normal as anything. And she said to him, George, I got your letter, and I was going to talk to you last night. And he said, what letter? I didn't write you a letter. And she said, you did, I have it there. He said, no, that's not my letter, I didn't send you that. And he gave her a week's rent in advance, and he said, I'm going up central London. He said he was living in Shepherd's Bush, and he said, I'm just going to see can I find myself a job. If you don't hear from me for a couple of days, don't worry. And she said, are you sure you're okay? And he said, no, I'm fine. He said, I'm giving you that rent in advance now, he said, for the week. And she said the following day the police knocked on the door and said, did he live there? And he had killed himself. He jumped under a train at Kensington station. So, and we didn't find out for a year, because in those days, not like today, you have DNA, you've all, and the cops here will coincide with British cops, American cops, or whatever. In those days, they didn't. And they had got his fingerprints on file from a time he had been in Manchester, and he had been picked up for, I think he was sleeping on a park bench or whatever, and they had taken his fingerprints. Now, he didn't always live like that, because I know he lived with an uncle of ours for a while, and he did live in this apartment for a while, but they kept his body for 5 weeks because they notified the Irish guards saying that all they had on him was that he was George Moore and the address here, and he was born in Dublin. That's all they had. Yeah. But the Irish guards never followed it up. They didn't follow it up. So as a result, if they hadn't kept him for 5 weeks, he would have gone in the last in a plot of 10. So he would have been the top coffin. But because they kept him the extra week, he was the first down in the next plot, and 9 people went on top of him. So my mum was never able to retrieve him or bring him home. And that broke her. That broke my mother altogether. It finished her off. And you see, there's a lot of guilt, which there's not now today. Today there's so much suicide. I find it so sad to have someone, sometimes like talking doesn't help somebody. If they're intent on doing it, they're going to do it. But if you catch somebody at the right time, you can't stop them. My mother felt such a guilt at the time, and at that time it was a terrible shame as well. It wasn't just guilt, it was also a terrible shame. And so she didn't talk about it, where she didn't talk about it for the first few months, because she was absolutely broken-hearted. And then when she did talk about it, she couldn't stop talking about it. Like, she would talk about it over and over and over again. And I think actually the day my mum died was the first time I saw her with, you could say, not a happy face, but at peace. I was sitting one night and I was actually thinking about my brother's suicide. At the time, suicide was starting, kind of being made more aware of in Ireland. And I tried to think about how he felt on the day he died, because apparently on the day he died, he was fine leaving the house that morning, but he was in a train station that the tracks had broken down. There was a problem with the signals. So you imagine London at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening when everyone's coming home from work and you're packed like sardines on a platform and you're told there's no train and the lights are green and they had to wait for this thing to fix up. Anyway, from the story which we later heard from somebody who was there, was that he was originally just waiting for the train, and then the more packed the station became, the more despondent he was getting. So he eventually sat down and he put his head into his hand. He sat down, and the longer the train was delayed, the more depressed he became. He was obviously thinking to himself, what am I doing here? Getting agitated, and the platform was getting more packed. Now, among the people on the platform, there was a young man, the same age as him, the same age as my brother, and he was 24 as well, and he had done a lot of his training for Oxford University. He wanted to be an Anglican priest, and he had gone through all this teaching, and he was actually on his way back home to tell his parents he wasn't going to go through with it because he wanted to be a priest of the people. He didn't want to be a pulpit basher, and they weren't agreeing to that. They wanted him to be up in the pulpit and doing mass or whatever they do. So he was on his way home to break this news to his parents that after all his years in college, he wasn't going to go through with it. But we later met up with him, and I will continue the story as in what he told us. So he said that the more he looked at George, he said, I was looking at him and I was thinking to myself, that fella looks very depressed. And he said the platform was getting more and more packed, and he said I actually was only about 3 or 4 people away from him. And he said next thing, he said the announcement came saying the problem on the line would soon be fixed and the train would be there very soon. And he said he stood up, and he said there was something about him standing up, he said, that I didn't quite like, I didn't get. He said he had this look on his face. He said he put his hand to his head, and he had this look of total defeat on his face. And he said he rolled his trousers up to his knees, and he said straight away, he said, the terrible thing is that in London we're so used to this happening that people switch off. He said people don't reach out and they don't try to help you. He said for all that's in me, I could have put my hand out and stopped him that day, but he said I'd never seen anyone committing suicide. And he said I just kept looking at him, he said, and tried to figure out what he was doing. And he said as the train came down and the lights went green, he said he walked over to the edge of the platform, and he said people moved away from him. Nobody, he said, put their hands out to stop him. He said, and he said I could have, he said the terrible thing is, he said I could have gone through these people and just put my hand out, he said, on his shoulder. He said, but he said I was so shocked. He said I didn't know whether I was shocked or whether I was just curious as to what he was going to do. He said, and he crossed his 2 arms over his chest, and he said as the train came around he jumped. And he said all of a sudden people start giving out saying, geez, here we are, delayed again, we're never going to get home. He said this was the attitude of, we say 50% of the people that were there. He said some people were shocked. 50%, it was a total inconvenience. And then he said people were shouting, is there a doctor? Because he's still alive. Is there a doctor? doctor on the platform, and he said, I just put my hand up, he said, and I just said, no, but I'm a priest. He said, can I get down? I'll talk to him. And he said, I actually climbed down through the train, and he said the top part of his body was there, and he said his legs had been cut off. He said, but he felt no pain. He said, no, he told my mother, he said he wasn't in any pain. So he said, I got down, and he said, I held his hand, and I said to him, what's your name? And he said, George. And he said, I just said, I detect a little bit of an Irish accent there. And he said, I'm from Shepherd's Bush. And he said, no, I think you're Irish, he said. And he said, I do think, he said, your family needs to know. He said, you are going to die. He said, do you know that? And he said, no. He said, I'm from Shepherd's Bush. He said, my name is George. And he said, with that, he said, well, I'm with you. And he said, I'm going to hold your hand until they get the strain off you. And they had to cut the strain off him, right? They couldn't shunt the strain up. And he said, I gave him the last sacraments of a Catholic. He said, and you know, he said, when they took him away, I knew I could be nothing but a priest. He said, changed my life. He said, because I never told my parents what I was thinking. And I went on to become an Anglican priest, and I became a priest of the streets and a priest of the people. I didn't become a pulpit priest. I got what I wanted, he said, and I reached out to all young men who were there, he said. But he said, I'll never forget him. From something bad came something good. Like it designed his life for him, and he went on then to be to working for the Seaman's Mission, which reaches out to young men who arrive in England and find they've no one to turn to. They're kind of like, not like the Samaritans, but he's like, I wrote a story called 1 Hour in Time, which it was 1 hour the train was late for, and I actually ended the story on where he jumped, and like I ended it there. And I met Joe Duffy then at a party with a friend of Sheila's, and we were talking. Joe Duffy was saying his brother had been killed on a motorbike, and I was telling him about Georgie's suicide, and I said, I've written a story, and then he said, oh God, send it into RTE drama department. So I said, no, I don't really, it's like it's private. He said, but you're not actually writing about him, you're writing your thoughts on how someone feels when they make that decision to do it. So I sent it off in, forgot all about it, and a few months later I got this call from Julian Finoles, who was a director over the drama department in RTE, and he says to me, hi, he said, I've only read your story, he said, it's been lying in the side of my briefcase now for months, and he said, I was cleaning out the briefcase last night, and he said, I came across it and I read it, and I walked his footsteps and I walked his mind, and he said, I just literally, he said, walked his whole life through that story. So he said, was this somebody you knew? And I said, well, my brother committed suicide, but I called it 1 Hour in Time because I was trying to capture how someone feels. And he said, oh no, he said, will you meet me, he says, for a cup of coffee? And I said, he said, I'd like to discuss using it, the story. He said, it's so brilliant, he said, I just kept reading it. I did go to meet Julian in Beauties in Grafton Street. So we were sitting, and he was saying to me, like, was this about your brother? And I said, yeah, well, I kind of, I never really got over the fact that he did that, but I was trying to go through his life and his reasons why he would have done it. But then I told him then about Chris Collinson, who was the young man who went on to become a priest, and he said, Jesus, that's another story. He said, can you get in touch with him? And I said, no. I said, my mum has died now. My mum kept in touch with him for years, but I wouldn't know how to get in touch with Chris. And believe it or not, Rebecca, this was like, as I say, I believe in angels. I went through all my mum's stuff, and I found one postcard from Chris Collinson, one with his telephone number on it and his address. And I phoned him, and I says to him, Chris, you don't know me, I said, but I'm Mary Moore's daughter, I said. And I said, you were right. And he said, oh yes. He said, how is she? And I said, well, unfortunately, I said, she passed away. I said, but I've written a story for an Irish company over here, I said, and they're very interested in speaking to you as to your aspect of, they didn't want to end the story just on Georgie's life being over. They wanted to know how your life went on. And he said, well, no, not really. He said, I don't feel I did anything. I'm so happy I was there for him. He said, but I don't feel like I should get any recognition for it. He said, because to me, he said, I would just feel feel that was wrong. He said, being recognised, I just did what came naturally to me at the time. And I said, well, okay, well, listen, thanks for your time. I said, lovely talking to you. Following day, Julian rings me up. Well, did you get in touch with him? He was real matter of fact. And I said, yeah, but Julian, he's not interested. Give me his number, he said. I think it was a Monday then. He rang me and he says to me, right, he said, now, are you all ready to travel? And I said, to where? And he says, we're off to London on Wednesday. Right, the two of us. He said, got an interview with Chris Collinson. He said, we're going to see him. We're going to your brother's grave. We're going to the whole lot. So he said, you're on now. So I'll pick you up at 1:30 on Wednesday. So I said, yeah, okay. Went to London. We went to the graveyard. And it was so funny because the graveyard was closed and he climbed over the gate and had to pull me over. And I had all the equipment and all, and we listened to the planes going over. The loneliness of his grave being the fact that it was an unmarked grave and that there was 9 people on top of him. There was actually 3 prisoners from Her Majesty's services who couldn't, you couldn't remove them. There was like people who couldn't afford a funeral and you couldn't disturb them either. And there was actually a baby on top of him that had been found. So it was ironic that Sheila had just had Stephen, and my mum had written her last letter to him was saying that Sheila had a baby and he was buried with a baby on top of him. So that was the ironic thing. And then I went into RTA and we did.
And Julian, was it just voice recordings with Julian, or was it or video? No, it was voice recordings, just like what we're doing now, like just really, yeah. And then you go as sisters now to George's grave.
We found the grave. Sheila's daughter had gone over beforehand and she had found it. I never forgot the number. It was CS 312. There was there was a digit missing, but I had to tell Debbie it was CS 312, and she found it, and the whole thing had sunk in, and like it was his was the only cross on it because my mum had put a cross on it with his name on it. So his was the only cross. So we got a proper headstone made. So we put like his whole name on it and united with, so we've a lovely headstone on it now. Like we were allowed to do it.
And do you think that you've had a blessed life?
I think I've had as happy a life as we are going to get in this world. Yeah, I have good kids. My 3 girls I have to say, are brilliant to me, my sons are grand. Yeah, I would say so. Made a few mistakes along the way, but I guess I'm still learning. Yeah, in some ways I suppose you could say blessed.
What would your legacy be? What will your kids tell the grandkids about you?
That I always loved them. I hope they could say that about me. I would say the kids would say I was always there for them.
Do you know what the one thing I'd say to you about your father? But you ended up with him.
I would go down to my dad's house at weekends and stay down there and look after him and my brother and do all the cleaning in the house. Then I go back to my own house, and it was going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. So finally I just said to my dad, look, I'll buy the house. And my dad said, no, just move in. I said, no. I will buy the house because I'll never have anybody saying that I got the house.
And what was your relationship like with your dad when you moved in, when you were together?
I stepped straight into my mum's shoes. Now, he worked right up to the time he died. He lived for 10 years after my mum died. He would walk in the door at 5:30 on the dot, and his dinner would be handed up to him. He'd turn on the Irish news and everybody scattered, and that was the way it was in my house. I used to say King Kong is home. Then I ended up looking after him for the 10 years, and I never held it against him, because I think even though you have your memories, I do think the greatest gift you can give yourself, Rebecca, is to forgive. You don't have to forget. You never have to forget. But you should always forgive. And I would sit and I'd have loads of long chats with me dad, afterwards, after my mum died, and I felt like he thought I was my mum there when he finally did kind of come to the end when he was dying. I would say he loved me, but never showed it. Probably not long before he got sick, he actually just got a cold that went onto his lungs, and he died within a few months. He was working right up to the time he got sick. I think a few months before that I'd had a huge row with him, and he'd come in from from work and he had said to me he wasn't feeling great, and he says, just do me a fry for dinner, right? And I said, do you want tomatoes with the fry? And he said, yeah, do me tomatoes. So I done him a lovely fry. I done him mashed sausages, white pudding, and I got the tomato I got was a big one, so I cut it all up. So when he came in from work, he sat down and put his dinner in front of him, and he looked at the plate and he said, Jesus, I didn't ask you for a pound of tomatoes, right? So I said to him, do you know what? I haven't heard the word thanks out of your mouth in all the years that I'm in here. You don't say thank you to me. I said, I've had enough of you now. I said, I'm not putting the dinner in front of you anymore. I said, you can forget it. I said, that is one tomato, I said, you've got. I said, and I've put up with all this now. I said, for all the years that I've been with you, no more, that's it. Well, the following morning, you see, my dad's way of doing things was not like saying, oh, I'm sorry, right? Following morning, he put £20. I was washing the dishes in the kitchen, and he put £20 down on the counter, and he said to me, go out and buy yourself something nice to wear. You see, that was his way of saying he was sorry, but he could never say he was sorry, you know.
So I'm going to ask everyone, tell me a terrible thing.
Like, my dad was always going out on strike, and we used to, when we were living in Churchtown, there was a convent in Milltown, and when my dad had come out on strike, in those days you got no money, so the nuns would always have they used to school lunches then, where they used to have little bottles of milk and sandwiches. So on the Fridays my mum would send me and Sheila on our bikes to Milltown Convent, and the nuns would give you a parcel.
How far was that away on the bike?
That was probably about half a mile, or it could have been a mile.
And how old were you then?
Jesus, we were only about, so we left church, and I'd say I was probably about 11 or 12, and Sheila would have been, coming up to, it was only a year and a few months between us, and the two of us would cycle down on our bike, and we never had lights on the bike, you know, because there was no houses, they were just all big long country roads. But I remember there was this big graveyard that we had to go by with these two statues of two big angels on the edge of the gate, and I was terrified of this graveyard, especially when it got dark, and we didn't go to the convent till it got dark because you had to wait till all the nuns were finished their prayers. Then you got to the convent and you'd ring the bell and the door would open straight out of Dracula. You know, this crunchy door would open, and you'd just hear the voice saying, come in. You know, come in. The man with the black cloak was standing there with the teeth hanging out in the fangs. So we'd walk in and stand there, and next thing the head nun would come down and hand us this parcel. Now the only good thing about the parcel was, for some reason, there was always little bars of Cadbury's chocolate in it. But anyway, this night we were on our way home, and me and Sheila were cycling like the clappers, and we had our little parcels tied to the front of our bikes, and just as we got to the graveyard, didn't the chain on my bike break, right? And I went flying off it. So I'm trying to hold on to Sheila's bike, and I'm trying to put the chain back on to my bike, and I'm begging her, please don't go, because I'm looking at this graveyard and I'm seeing these two big statues staring at me, and I thought, oh Jesus, it's going to be night of the living dead, they're all going to start crawling out of the graves, right? And Sheila said, no, I promise you. And I said, promise me now, promise me on your life you won't cycle off, please, because I had to let go of the bike to put on the chain. And she said, no, I promise you I won't. The minute I let go of her bike, she went cycling off, right? So I'm stuck at this graveyard with the chain off the bike, and I'm trying to put it on, and I start screaming, and I screamed the whole mile home down a country lane, and I didn't know if there was bats coming behind me, Dracula was coming behind me, I didn't know, but the whole way home I screamed, and I couldn't talk the next morning. I screamed that much, and Sheila was in the house, and she was home, and she was in fits of laughing, and my mum said that was a terrible thing to do. I found a coin once, and it looked like a half crown. I don't know if you probably won't remember a half crown, like it was 2 and 6. So I found this coin, and I said, great. I used to buy my friends because I always wanted everyone to love me. So I had the girl next door, and I think about 3 other girls who lived in the area, and I said, come on, I'll treat us all to ice cream wafers. So we went into this little shop, it was called the Red Hut, and I ordered 5 wafers, and it was great. So we all stand there with our wafer, we all took a bite out of it, and next thing your man's looking at this coin, and he said, what's this? And I said, it's 2 and 6. And he said, no, it's not. He said, that's a coin, that's no good. And I went, can we give our ice cream back? And he said, no, you can't. He said, you've all bitten it. I'll put it on your mother's bill. Oh, I'll tell you, Rebecca, did I get hiding? Oh my God, because my mum went on the Friday and she said, I can't believe, she said, you treated all your friends to ice cream. I had the legs walloped off me.
And on that note, as I said to you, Peggy, very, very fond of you. You're a lady. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Rebecca, and it's been lovely speaking to you. And good luck. Hope somebody else enjoys us as well.
Thanks, Peggy.
Thank you.